Good morning to all. Today we shall begin our history first chapter. Our chapter name is When, Where and How. Listen, what is our chapter name? When, where and how. When, where and how. First, in order to study this chapter, first we can study what do you mean by history. We already studied that in 6th standard, isn't it? History is a past event set in a chronological order. Which are the classification of history? History is mainly divided into 3. First one, prehistory, proto-history and history. Prehistory. Prehistory means in that period. We know about that period only through the historical evidences which is used by our ancestors. There is no written records. Then proto-history. Proto-history means what? In proto-history, written records are there, but we can't interpret that one. Yet now we can't interpret that written records. Then history. In a history, written records and evidences are there. We can interpret everything. These are the classification of history. What do you mean by history? History is a past event set in a chronological order. Then classification of history. History is mainly divided into 3. Prehistory, proto-history and history. On the basis of its evidences, the classification is done by how? Done by on the basis of evidences. Now, in this chapter, in this book, textbook, history, we will study about the history of India. History of India. Then, now we can study about the importance of date in a history. Importance of date in a history. Importance of date in a history, otherwise dates and events. What is the role of a date in a history? Listen, without a date there is no existence for a history. If you know the date, then only that historical things will get a. If you know the date, then only that historical events will be success. Otherwise, there is no use of a historical events. Then that is why in a historical evidences, dates are very, very important one. First one, date help us to know about events. First, dates help us to know about the events which in events in a order. Date helps us to know about the events in a order. Second one, the chronological arrangements of events. The chronological, in a history, how we are arranging the events? In a chronological order. That means in a ascending order, we are ordering, we are marking our events. That chronological events help us to understand about the political, economical and social development of a time. Chronological order of historical events help us to know about the social, cultural and economic development social, cultural and economic development of a particular time. Listen, importance of date in a history. History help us know about the events in a order. Moreover, we are arranging the history in a chronological order. That is why the chronological arrangement help us, historical events help us to know about the social, cultural and economic development of that time, that particular time. These are the importance of a date in a history. Next, one more importance is there. Dates themselves, there is no significance. Dates themselves, there is no significance. But if we connect with the process which is happen in a particular period of time. Happen in a particular period of time. Listen, did you get any idea about this point? Date themselves, there is no significance. If we connect with the process which is happen in a particular period of time, which is happen in a, that means, for example, invention of wheel. Invention of a wheel, there is no one. If you know only about the invention of wheel, that time there is no significance for that date. But the invention of wheel leads to a tremendous change in the transportation. The invention of a wheel leads to a tremendous change in the transportation during the ancient period itself. That is why the time of invention of a wheel is very important. Because of that, we are telling that the date itself there is no significance. If we are attached that date with the process which is happen in a particular period, that is very important. Did you get an idea about the importance of date now? Importance of date. First one, it will helps to know about the events in a order. Then the chronological order of a historical events help us to know about the social, economic and cultural development of a period, of a particular period. Then third one, date itself there is no significance for that, but if we attach that within any process which is happen in a particular period, then at that time the date will be very significant one, or will be a very important one. For example, invention of wheel. Invention of wheel leads to a tremendous change in the field of a transportation. That is the importance of date in a history. Next one, classification of history. Or a division of time into periods. Division of time into periods. Listen. Division of time. A British historian, James Mill, divided Indian history into three. Who? James Mill, a British historian, James Mill, divided Indian history into three. Which are they? Hindu, Muslim, and British. This division is done by whom? James Mill, a British historian, divided Indian history into three: Hindu, Muslim and British. How he divided the history? According to the religion of the rulers and their language. According to the religion of the rulers and their language, James Mill divided Indian history into three sections: Hindu, Muslim and British. Listen. Hindu period is considered up to 1200 century. That means 12th century. Up to 12th century is considered as a Hindu period in a Indian history. That means up to 12th century we had a Hindu rulers. We had a Hindu rulers. Those who are using one Sanskrit text. That is why James Mill divide Indian history up to 12th century as a Hindu period. After 12th century, when the Muslim rulers are established their power here, that period is known as a Muslim period. That means Muslim rulers and they were using Persian language. That is why that period is known as a Muslim period. Then after the establishment of a British power here, that period is known as a British period. That is the first categorization of Indian history. James Mill divided Indian history into three parts according to the religion of rulers and their language. That division is done on the basis of religion of the rulers and their language. Division was like this: Hindu, Muslim and British. Hindu period is considered up to 12th century. After that, before British rule, that medieval period is known as a Muslim period, and after the establishment of a British power, that period is known as a British period. That is the first division of Indian history. Then next one, new historians recently our historians are divided our Indian history into three parts. That is known as ancient, medieval and modern. Which are the ancient, medieval and modern? And modern. Ancient, medieval and modern. Who done that categorization? New historian. Recently historians are divided our Indian history into three parts. That is known as ancient Indian history, medieval Indian history and modern Indian history. That is the new categorization of Indian history. Next one, sources of information. Sources of modern Indian history. Sources of modern Indian history. Listen, sources are mainly categorized into two. First one, primary source and secondary source. Primary sources and secondary sources. Listen, what do you mean by a primary source? Primary source means the archaeological things which we can found in historical sites. That means artifacts, coins, then monuments, like that things are considered as a primary source. Primary source means what? Archaeological evidences which is used by our ancestors. Then second one, secondary source means literary sources. Literary sources like that magazine, newspapers, biographies, autobiography, poems, narrations, like that things are considered as a secondary sources. Listen. Now today we studied about what? When, where and how. That first we studied about history. Definition of history. What do you mean by this history? History is a set of past events which is order and a chronological set in a chronological event. History is a past event set in a chronological order. Then divisions of history, which are the prehistory, protohistory and history. What is the difference between that? In a history, every written evidences are there which we can interpret very easily. But in a proto-history, written evidences are there. Still, now we can't interpret that one. Then prehistory means what? We know about that period only through the archaeological things or which are from their remains which is used by our ancestors. That these are the classification of history. Next one, importance of date in a history. There are three importance are there. First one, history help us to know the importance of a dates. That means date help us to know the events in a order. If there is no dates, if our historians didn't mention any date, we don't know in which period that is happened. That is why when our historians note the dates, it is very easy to understand. They recognize the events which took place in a particular time. Then next one, chronological arrangement. Chronological arrangement help us to know about the development or which are the changes happen in each period. Which are the changes happen in each period. That means social development, economic development, cultural development, like that things are such a knowledges are getting through the chronological arrangement. For example, during the period of a Stone Age, which are the things are used by the human beings. Then again Stone Age is divided into Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic. Different types of weapons are used by them. Through the examples and according to the period, it is very easy to recognize the development of that particular period. Then last one, the date itself there is no significance. If a date only there is no significance for that date. If we are attached with the process of development which has happened during that period, then only that date will become important one. The date themselves there is no significance. If we are attached with that the process of development which took place in a particular time, then only that date will become important one. These are the importance of a date in a history. And then second one, which is the next topic, division of time into periods. That is known as a division of time into periods. That is known as a periodization. For our convenience, our historians divided our history into different periods. First, a British historian, James Mill, divided our Indian history into three parts according to the religion of rulers and their language. He divided Indian history into three, which are the Hindu, Muslim and British. That means up to 12th century, they were James Mill considered as a Hindu period because Hindu rulers and Sanskrit texts are used by that period. That is why that period is known as what? That period is known as a Hindu period. After that, after 12th century, when the Muslims emperors are established their power here and they were used the Persian language, that period is known as a Muslim period. After the subjugation of whom? Britishers. When the Britishers subjugate our country and when they established their power here, that period onwards, it is known as a British period. That is the categorization or a division made by the James Smith. Next one, modern historians. That means recently our historians divided our Indian history into three, which are the ancient, medieval and modern. Ancient period, medieval period and modern period. That is the new categorization of a history. Then sources of history. Next, sources of modern Indian history. That is mainly divided, two categorizations are there. First, in a first category divided into two, primary sources and secondary sources. In a primary source, which are the artifacts, coins, monuments and remains of everything which is left by our ancestors, that is considered as a primary sources of Indian history. And a secondary source means what? Literary things, which is orally transmitted one, and newspaper, magazine, poems, such a things are considered as a secondary sources. Listen, few more sources are there that we can study next session. That's all. If you have any doubt, you can ask me. That's all. Have a nice day. Thank you.